Investigators say more than half of the prison's 99 employees have been involved in some form of sexual misconduct, and male guards regularly have sexual interaction with inmates.
Across the globe, some female inmates face unimaginable suffering, from forced labor to unthinkable punishments. These women live a nightmare most of us will never understand. Now, get ready to step inside their hidden reality. These are 13 of the world's toughest female prisons.
أحياناً بحكي بقول لو كنت ميتة كان أحسن لي، بس ما في إحساس أبداً بالمرة، مات إحساسي.
Located in the quiet countryside of Derbyshire, England, Foston Hall Prison might seem like just another facility, but beneath the surface, a much darker story unfolds. Home to around 300 women spread across 5 wings, Foston Hall feels less like a place of rehabilitation and more like a pressure cooker, fueled by overcrowding, violence, and an overwhelming sense of despair. However, on paper, it seems like there's hope. The prison supposedly offers various programs to help women gain skills and qualifications. Some work in the gardens, workshops, or maybe kitchens. Others enroll in courses for hairdressing and cleaning service. It all sounds kind of promising, right? But the reality is far from it. Foston Hall has recently earned the grim title of the most violent women's prison in England and Wales. According to a shocking report by the HM Chief Inspector of Prisons, the women there make over 1,000 calls a month to the Samaritans, a charity dedicated to reducing feelings of isolation and disconnection that can lead to suicide. Now, that's just a little taste of the mental health crises inside these walls. What's more, violence and self-harm are also alarmingly common. Despite attempts to control the chaos, assaults between prisoners are on the rise. 2021, the prison was rated poor for safety, the lowest rating possible. And it wasn't just the violence, it was the fact that no one seemed to have a real plan to fix it. A year later, inspectors reported little had changed. Foston Hall remained a place where violence was the norm, and safety felt like more of a distant dream than a reality. For the women inside, fear is a constant companion. One inspector noted in their report, "Compared to the other women's prisons, Foston Hall felt very different in terms of violence." And that's saying something. To add to this, there was a shortage of staff as well. Inspectors found that on one day, just 13 officers were on duty to supervise 28 units, less than half of what's needed to keep the prison running safely. It's no wonder the situation feels like it's spiraling out of control. And then there are the tragedies. One of the most heartbreaking cases was the death of 25-year-old Yasmin Adams. 2016, Yasmin, who had a history of self-harm and had been diagnosed with emotionally unstable personality disorder, was found hanging from a shower rail. On the day she died, she was supposed to be checked 4 times an hour. Instead, 29 minutes would pass between observations. Yasmin tragically passed away in the hospital a day later. An inquest later revealed a series of failures, from inadequate staff training to the use of unsuitable cells. Yasmin's death led to calls for the removal of fixed shower rails, which pose a clear risk, but for her, the changes came too late. Now, steps have been taken to improve things, like forming a new safety team and putting senior staff in charge of handling the most violent prisoners. But many feel these measures are like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, especially since Foston Hall isn't an isolated case. Over in Cheshire, HM Prison Styal has its own dark history. Once an orphanage, it has since become one of UK's most notorious women's prisons, plagued by bullying, drug abuse, and alarmingly high suicide rates, with at least 11 suicides in recent years, more than any other women's prison in England. Styal's reputation is grim, with one prison calling it hell on earth. The most recent tragedy would occur as recently as July 2024. This devastating incident, like so many others, points to a prison system in desperate need of reform. 1942. Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, located in Wetumpka, Alabama, opened its doors for the first time. It was named after prison reform advocate Julia S. Tutwiler, once known as the Angel of the Prisons. Now, she dedicated her life to pushing for better treatment of prisoners, and for many, symbolized hope in a system often filled with despair. But don't be fooled by the history behind the prison's name. Before long, Tutwiler Prison became infamous for housing Alabama's female death row inmates and for the horrendous conditions inside its walls. Initially designed to hold up to 700 women, it's now known for overcrowding, abuse, and neglect. For years, reports of systemic sexual abuse and violence have made it one of the worst places for women in the U.S. prison system. In 2014, the DOJ released a shocking report that called Tutwiler a sexualized environment, where women inside weren't just unsafe, they were being violated by the very guards meant to protect them. Many inmates reported being assaulted, harassed, and coerced into sexual acts by the guards, just to be able to get basic necessities like sanitary products. And this kind of abuse wasn't isolated. It was part of the fabric of life inside Tutwiler. For nearly 2 decades, staff had abused their power without consequence. Women who spoke up faced retaliation, often ending in some solitary confinement or losing contact with their families. Some would even find their complaints ignored or twisted, making their voices seem like whispers in a toxic environment where no one's listening.
When you see officers that are actually attacking inmates or sexually abusing them, and you're told you better not say nothing or you're in trouble.
May 2013. This horrific truth came to light when Mother Jones magazine named Tutwiler one of the 10 worst prisons in America. A report was followed by an investigation by the Equal Justice Initiative, EGI, which ended up revealing that several women had become pregnant after being sexually abused by prison staff. One former inmate described living in constant fear, saying, "You're always at risk. It's not safe to shower or sleep when certain officers are around. They'll extort you, manipulate you into sexual favors. It's horrifying." And despite these gut-wrenching stories, justice was rare. Between 2009 and 11, only 6 officers were convicted of sexual abuse, and just one served a little more than 5 days in jail. In 2014, federal investigators finally stepped in, conducting a thorough review that uncovered a staggering amount of corroborating evidence. They concluded that the prison not only failed to protect its inmates, but had actively created an environment where abuse thrived. The findings were a harsh indictment of the Alabama Department of Corrections, which had been aware of the conditions for years but chose to ignore them.
Investigators say more than half of the prison's 99 employees have been involved in some form of sexual misconduct, and male guards regularly have sexual interaction with inmates.
In 2016, Alabama Governor Robert J. Bentley promised to close the prison, a plan that gave hope to many. But today, Tutwiler's still open. While a few steps have been taken, like replacing the warden, the core issues persist. Systemic abuse, overcrowding, and poor health care continue to plague the facility. And while the story of Julia Tutwiler Prison is indeed one of a broken system where reform is often promised but rarely delivered, tragically, the women inside continue to suffer in silence, waiting for the change that never seems to come. Located in the hills about 29 kilometers from Tegucigalpa, Honduras' capital, Tamar's Women's Center for Social Adaptation was meant to house around 400 women. Today, it holds twice that, between 800 and 900 inmates. That overcrowding isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. Now, this prison has become a battleground for 2 of Honduras' most notorious gangs, 18th Street and MS-13. June 20th, 2023. Years of tension between these deadly rivals reached a horrifying peak when violence and tension escalated into this horrific massacre that really shocked the South American nation and the rest of the world. Several inmates had been receiving death threats for weeks before the attack, but despite warnings, nothing was done to stop the inevitable. And so, when the attack came, it was as brutal as it was well planned. The 18th Street Gang had somehow smuggled in weapons and locked their enemies in their cells before setting the place on fire, trapping their victims in this terrifying inferno all while shooting and attacking them with their weapons. Honduras's national police reported that the carnage left 26 women burnt to death, while many others were shot or stabbed. In total, 46 women had lost their lives that day. After the carnage, investigators found munitions, including pistols, grenades, and even machine guns, making it clear that this wasn't a spontaneous riot, but a well-calculated, organized attack. Now, this massacre brought back memories of other horrifying prison disasters in the region. Let's go to 2017. A fire in the Guatemalan detention center claimed the lives of 41 girls. Even worse, further back in 2012, Honduras experienced its deadliest prison disaster, with 361 inmates losing their lives in a fire at Comayagua Penitentiary. The aftermath of Tamar's riots brought lots of international attention. The Honduran government responded by declaring a state of emergency and vowed to crack down on corruption and violence within the prison system. However, many remain skeptical. Gangs have long maintained control inside Honduras's prisons, creating their own underground economies, bribing guards, and continuing their violent operations with little fear of repercussion. Julissa Villanueva, head of the prison system, insisted that the crackdown on illegal activity inside the prisons was the catalyst for the riot. She declared, "We will not back down." Yet, to this day, Tamar's Women's Center for Social Adaptation is still a place where survival is uncertain, violence is inevitable, and hope is in short supply. Pollsmoor Prison, located in Cape Town's Takai suburb, is one of the most notorious max-security prisons in the world. Running with more than double its capacity for over a decade, the conditions inside these walls have been described as nothing short of horrendous by human rights advocates.
Walls designed to keep dangerous inmates out of sight, also hiding allegations of abuse, disease outbreaks, severe overcrowding.
Pollsmoor is a place where survival isn't guaranteed, especially for the women. Prisoners are crammed in tight spaces designed for 25 to 30 people, with 65 to 80 sharing a single cell. That's not even enough room to stand without bumping into somebody. And with only one toilet and a shower for everyone, the situation becomes unbearable fast. So with no ventilation, the air is often thick, stifling, and often unbreathable. And inmates are locked up inside for up to 23 hours a day. Oh, and with no access to books or any ways to distract their minds, the suffocating atmosphere really becomes their constant companion. While Pollsmoor is often associated with its infamous male prisoners, the women in here endure some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Out of more than 8,000 prisoners, only around 740 are women, but their struggles are often overlooked. 2016, investigative journalist Ruth Hopkins from the Wits Justice Project visited this prison's women's section and saw firsthand what life was like behind the walls. One of the first women she spoke to was Palesa, who was in her mid-30s at the time. Palesa had been attacked by a violent cellmate, leaving her with scars, both physical and emotional. Even after requesting an HIV test following that assault, she was denied, and now has to live with the uncertainty for the rest of the time she's there. Palesa had been awaiting her trial for nearly 3 years after being arrested for killing her boyfriend in what she claims was self-defense during a violent argument. But in a desperate attempt to make sense of her situation, she began blogging from within the prison, sharing her experiences with the world. In this desperate attempt to make sense of her situation, she began blogging from within the prison, sharing her experiences with the world. She would highlight the twisted power dynamics in the prison kitchen, where the so-called kitchen ladies run the show. These women use food and cigarettes as currency, controlling others by trading things for favors. And then there's the trunk ma system, where female wardens take on adopted inmates in exchange for money, food, or favors. Palesa refused to get involved, but not everyone had a choice. For some, these relationships turned pretty dark, with sexual favors being exchanged for basic necessities or even protection. Palesa also described the brutal punishments known as toppers. Wardens would strike inmates' fingers with broomsticks, a form of discipline designed to break spirits rather than maintain order. This brutal reality extends to the awaiting trial section, where life is even more miserable. Grace Nienaber, a former inmate who was convicted of fraud, spent over 2 years in Pollsmoor just waiting for her trial. In this interview, she recalled the filthy, cramped conditions she had to endure. Around 70 women were packed into a cell meant for just 30. Many were forced to sleep on the floor, toilets were frequently broken, and warm water was a luxury no one had. With so many people crammed together in such unsanitary conditions, communicable diseases like tuberculosis spread like wildfire. It's really no surprise given the environment. She also remembered that once 4 inmates, all mentally ill, reported being sexually assaulted after lockdown, when most of the staff had already gone home. And what was the warden's response? They simply shrugged and said, "This is what happens in prison." Medical care at Pollsmoor is also severely lacking. One official who works in the women's section revealed that the entire prison has just 1 psychologist, 1 doctor, and 1 dentist to handle the needs of thousands of inmates. Women who are HIV positive or suspected of having tuberculosis often don't receive any treatment, leaving them to suffer in silence and sometimes die. Despite the countless stories of abuse, neglect, and the horrific conditions, the Department of Correctional Services has consistently declined to comment. And for the women inside Pollsmoor, every day is just another day in a system that seems to have forgotten them. Kigali, Rwanda's capital, is often praised for its cleanliness and order. It's a far cry from the chaos that followed the '94 genocide, which claimed an estimated 1 million lives. Today, you won't find many street children, beggars, or even sex workers on Kigali streets. Even vendors are quick to pack up and disappear if the police show up. But beneath the city's pristine surface lies a troubling reality. The reason behind this polished reputation isn't as rosy as it seems. The Rwanda National Police routinely round up people they consider undesirable and send them to Gikondo Transit Center, an unofficial detention facility hidden away in a residential area of Kigali. A huge percentage of those sent there are women.
kuzajya kumfunga bavuga ngo nukugenda ngo banshyire mu ngororamicyo bakagenda bakanyicisha inzara nk'uko nguko bakazandekura muha n'umuyaga byo bivuze.
Once inside, detainees are subjected to abuse, overcrowded conditions, and human rights violations. A recent report by Human Rights Watch has shed light on the horrifying conditions inside Gikondo. Former detainees described being packed into overcrowded rooms, where beatings and mistreatment were common. Some were detained for only a few days, while others were held for months, even years. None of them ever charged with a crime or even given a trial. The living conditions in here are appalling. Detainees face abuse from both the police and fellow inmates. Something as small as talking too loudly or not standing in line to use the toilet could result in a beating. Basic necessities like food and water are in short supply, and sleeping arrangements were just as bad. People are crammed into tight spaces and forced to sleep on the floor, often without mattresses. When mattresses were provided, they were shared by multiple people and infested with lice and fleas. Sanitation's a big problem here. These people are forced to use an open trench as a toilet, creating this disgusting, unsafe, and disease-ridden environment. And despite being labeled as a rehabilitation center, Gikondo provides no real care or support. There's little to no access to medical treatment. And visitors, including lawyers, are not allowed in, leaving detainees without any form of legal assistance or outside support. A 40-year-old woman recounted her first experience at Gikondo. When she arrived, she was greeted by what guards called a welcome party. She watched in horror as street children were beaten first, followed by women who were struck on their feet. Men were forced to lie on their stomachs while police beat them on their buttocks. Months later, the physical and emotional scars of that experience still haunted her. Human Rights Watch has identified 4 detention centers like Gikondo across Rwanda, with the possibility of even more remaining unreported. Despite international pressure, these centers are still operating to this day, and thousands of people continue to suffer inside them. The Indian prison system, like many around the world, was built with men in mind. Women are often an afterthought. confined to cramped places with little access to even the most basic facilities. In Karnataka's prisons, some women spend days without even seeing sunlight. But it's not just the lack of space or air that's suffocating, it's the indifference toward their needs and sometimes the horrific abuse they endure. Take Parapana Agrahata Central Prison, the largest in Karnataka, as an example. It was designed to house 2,000 inmates, but now it holds close to 4,500. Just imagine being crammed in there, which is meant for only 1 or 2 people, only to find yourself sharing it with 8 or 9 others. You don't have room to breathe, no privacy, and dignity is a distant memory. But the overcrowding is just a taste of this cake. Recently, a scandal rocked the prison when it came to light that female prisoners were being sold to male inmates. You heard that right. Some guards were even involved in this scheme, profiting by exploiting the women they were supposed to protect. At first, authorities denied these accusations, but investigations revealed the darker reality. Women were forced to work night shifts in the kitchen to hide what was really going on. The guards responsible were eventually removed from their positions, but it's not clear if they ever faced legal repercussions. However, other prisons like those in Mumbai's Kalyan and Baikula areas tell a similarly bleak story. We have over 1,000 women packed into tight spaces meant for just 150, and each woman is given a single bar of soap each month to bathe, wash clothes, and clean their utensils. The result? Skin infections and illnesses that are too many to count. And with just 2 toilets to share between them, many women suffer frequent urinary tract infections. At night, they huddle together, packed into every available inch of space. But perhaps the harshest reality these women face isn't physical, it's emotional. The stigma surrounding female prisoners in India is intense. Families often disown them, unable to accept that their mothers, daughters, or wives could be criminals. So without family support, these women are left to fend for themselves. There's no one bringing them basic supplies, not even an extra bar of soap or even sanitary pads. No one to even help them navigate the legal system. Many don't even know where their cases stand. They're simply waiting, forgotten by those on the outside. Healthcare is another challenge here. Women with chronic conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure often go without medication until their health deteriorates to the point of crisis. Then and only then are they taken to the hospital. And then there are the children. Innocent bystanders caught in the prison system's failings. Many of them have never known life beyond the walls of a prison. Today, over 2,000 children are living with their mothers in Indian prisons. While courts have ruled that they can stay with their mothers until the age of 6, it's still clear that the prison is no place for them to grow up. Many of these little boys and girls receive little to no education and are just completely cut off from the outside world. And even after they turn 6 and are supposed to be transferred to protective custody, many remain trapped behind bars, just lost in a system that has long since forgotten about them. One of the most infamous women's prisons in Afghanistan is Badam Bagh in Kabul, where life for female inmates is grueling, to say the least. Many of these women aren't hardened criminals. They're locked away for so-called moral crimes. Now, these could be anything from fleeing abusive homes to simply being seen with a man who isn't a relative. 2014, BBC journalist Kawun Kamush visited Badam Bagh. He met with women and listened to their stories, witnessing firsthand the harsh conditions they had to endure. Many of them were in here without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. Some had been waiting for justice for years, just to be caught in limbo. The prison itself is a crumbling structure with about 2,000 small rooms spread over 3 floors. Each room, initially designed for maybe a couple of people, holds around 10 women. In these cramped, suffocating spaces, you'll find a mix of personalities that include convicted murderers, drug traffickers, and women accused of moral crimes. Kamush met a young girl named Kabela during his first visit. She had traveled from Baghashan to Kabul with a boy and was thrown into prison for it. Her teeth were broken and her right hand was injured. When asked what happened, she simply said, "I fight with anyone, my roommates, officers, and guards." Then we have the children. Similar to the Indian prisons, many Afghani children have been born and raised behind bars alongside their mothers, living in unsanitary conditions and lacking access to their basic necessities. One mother serving a 14-year sentence spoke of her fear for her children's future. She said, "There'll be young boys and girls when I'm released, and I know they'll ask me what crimes they committed." Well, back then life in Badam Bagh was definitely harsh, but when the Taliban took control in August 2021, it became a nightmare. Women are now banned from secondary and university education, from working in any official capacity, and even from going to parks or traveling without a male relative. Any woman breaking these rules could find herself in a place like Badam Bagh, enduring unimaginable horrors. Now, before the Taliban's takeover, there was at least some support for women who were victims of gender-based violence, like a lawyer, shelter, medical care, counseling. But now, that's all gone. Women who try to escape abusive situations risk ending up in prison themselves. And what happens to them behind those walls is horrifying. Take earlier this year, The Guardian reported on a shocking video showing a female Afghan human rights activist being sexually assaulted and tortured by 2 Taliban men while incarcerated. She recounted that she was arrested for protesting against the Taliban. After fleeing Afghanistan, she bravely spoke out against the regime from exile, only to receive threats from the Taliban. They sent her the video of her assault, warning that they would share it with her family and on social media if she continued to criticize them. She believes it was blackmail to silence and shame her. Tragically, her case isn't the only one documented regarding women's abuse in Taliban prisons. Another time, a woman's body was discovered in a canal weeks after her arrest by Taliban militants, with reports indicating that she had been sexually abused before her death. In November 2022, Afghan activist Zarifa Yaqubi was imprisoned for over 40 days for attempting to organize a movement for Afghan women. During her captivity, she revealed that she endured electric shocks and physical abuse. Ultimately, she was coerced into confessing that she had accepted money from foreigners to protest against the Taliban. Similarly, activist Parwana Nejarabi shared her harrowing experience of being beaten and tortured with electric shocks by Taliban forces after advocating for women's rights that same year. She had spent a month in solitary confinement and was shown a letter ordering her to be stoned to death. Under extreme duress, Nejarabi confessed to the charges and eventually escaped Afghanistan to live in exile. Despite the brutality, Afghan women continue to protest, refusing to be silenced. In the past 2 years alone, there have been over 220 acts of protest by women and girls across the country. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming oppression serves as an inspiring example for every woman around the world. Qarchak Prison, known as Iran's most notorious women's correctional facility, sits in the dry lands of Qarchak County, just outside of Tehran. Originally a livestock farm, this prison has since become a nightmarish environment where basic health and sanitation are forgotten. Like many others, overcrowding is a major issue here. Reports indicate that the prison's 7 sections contain more than 2,000 inmates, crammed into a space of just 1,500 square meters. What's more, the prison has only one hall with around 600 beds, so many women have no choice but to sleep on the floor, struggling to find any free space. But overcrowding is just the tip of this iceberg. Inside, the conditions are nothing short of inhumane. The prison's overrun with vermin, and the scorching heat makes things a lot worse. Inmates don't just deal with mice and lizards, but we have dangerous creatures like poisonous tarantulas. And for those battling lice, the only solution is to shave your head, as proper medication isn't available.
When the guard was shaving my hair, he was purposely shaving in a way that would cut my skin very painfully. And he left a little patch of hair in front just to bother me.
You can imagine life here is also filled with cruelty and abuse. Women face torture, including sexual assault, and are humiliated daily by guards. The psychological burden is overwhelming, as numerous prisoners experience untreated mental health problems, so healthcare is nearly non-existent. Women who work in the kitchen and boiler room lack access to burn treatments, and essential medical tests are often delayed, even for serious conditions like cancer. One inmate said, "The clinic situation's a disgrace," explaining how injuries are treated on beds stained with blood from previous patients. Go ahead and add food scarcity to their suffering. Meals intended for 80 people are served to over 120 people, and the quality is very poor. Fresh fruit arrives once a month, often at inflated prices, leaving many hungry. Also, those who can afford it buy bottled water, as the prison supply is usually salty or muddy. But despite these harsh realities, inmates strive to share their stories, refusing to be broken or silenced.
When they were raping and torturing me and putting out cigarettes in my body.
Recently, 2 political prisoners, Narges Mohammadi and Ali Motalebzadeh, publicly called Qarchak a torture chamber, drawing attention to the neglect and abuse they endured. The two would share that they had received chilling death threats from other prisoners just because they were political prisoners. Their testimony raised a lot of concern about a systematic effort to intimidate political detainees. Not only that, but their lawyer was even arrested for speaking out about these threats, just highlighting the dangers of trying to expose the horror within Qarchak. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Reporters Without Borders, have condemned the shocking conditions and demanded international attention. Yet, to this day, life inside Qarchak remains a haunting example of human rights violations. In the cold northern province of Heilongjiang, China, Heilongjiang's women prison has recently gained a notorious reputation for its harsh treatment of inmates, especially those imprisoned for their beliefs. Now, recently, chilling reports have surfaced about the brutal abuse faced by practitioners of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice targeted by the Chinese Communist Party since 1999. When these prisoners first arrived, they were subjected to horrifying treatment. They went through degrading body searches, and their personal belongings were often taken away. New arrivals were then separated and taken to various parts of the prison, like drying in restrooms, where they were subjected to relentless torture. The harsh cold weather only added to the suffering. Many of these prisoners didn't have warm clothing, often wearing just thin garments and slippers. And to make it worse, guards deliberately left windows open, exposing them to freezing temperatures. But not only that, these practitioners were beaten, denied sleep, and forced to sit motionless on small stools for hours. Oh, the torment keeps going, as they had a calculated effort to break your spirit. Prisoners are coerced into renouncing their faith through brainwashing techniques, and are made to endure verbal and physical abuse while holding back their basic bodily needs for hours, sometimes even for the entire day. Sadly, this pattern of abuse has led to countless fatalities. Over the past 20 years, thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have died due to severe mistreatment in custody, often from lack of medical care and the health complications that arise from their horrific conditions and torture. And because of this, Heilongjiang Women's Prison is now nicknamed the Cemetery of Falun Gong Ladies. Even more alarming are reports of forced organ harvesting. Oh yeah, investigations by former lawmakers and human rights activists revealed that some prisoners are executed to supply organs for transplants to recipients in various Chinese hospitals.
We do know for a fact that there's large-scale executions in China. We do know for a fact that executed prisoners have their organs harvested unwilling, without their consent.
So these revelations show a disturbing lack of respect for human rights, as individuals are just being dehumanized simply because of their beliefs. And sadly, that brutal treatment extends beyond just Falun Gong practitioners. Since 2014, it's reported that there's an ongoing human rights abuse against the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, often described as persecution or even genocide. Reports from various human rights organizations detail mass arbitrary arrests, torture, widespread surveillance, cultural and religious persecution, family separations, forced labor, sexual violence, and violations of reproductive rights. Both cases serve as a brutal reminder of how those in power are sometimes willing to strip away every ounce of human dignity just to control every aspect of their people's lives. Inspired by the Arab Spring, Syrians flocked the streets hoping for justice and an end to Bashar al-Assad's rule. But this somewhat peaceful uprising quickly turned into a devastating civil war. The Assad regime, determined to crush any opposition, unleashed extreme violence that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions. But for those who weren't killed in the fighting, an even darker fate awaited them inside Saydnaya prison. Known as the human slaughterhouse, Saydnaya had become the most feared prison in Syria. It was a place where survival was a daily struggle, and prisoners faced horrors that defied the worst imaginations. Innocent civilians, political activists, and peaceful protesters were all thrown into its grim walls, where death was a constant companion. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, since the start of the war, an estimated 30,000 people have died in Saydnaya. Torture, starvation, and mass executions were routine, and for many, this wasn't just a prison, it was a death sentence. Inside those walls, torture came in many horrific forms. Prisoners endured savage beatings, sexual assaults, decapitations, and even being burned. One of the most feared methods was the flying carpet, where prisoners are strapped to this wooden board and bent backward until their bodies couldn't take it anymore. By 2017, reports surfaced of a crematorium built to dispose of bodies after mass executions, cementing Saydnaya's reputation as a place where people were sent not to be interrogated or even punished, but simply to die. And for women, the nightmare was even worse.
بيوقفوني يعني بيرفعوني عن الأرض على رؤوس أصابعي. يروح يجيب الكهرباء ويكهربني وأنا مشبوحة وقت اللي إغماء قال مشان أصحى.
These women went through things no human should face. One woman, Ida, was forced to endure burns from cigarettes, while another, Janan, was repeatedly beaten and sexually assaulted so brutally that she eventually begged her captors to stop, offering to give up her own children just to make the pain go away. Oh, and the psychological torture was just as relentless. These poor women are haunted by the sight of dead bodies, blood-stained walls, and the screams of prisoners being tortured every minute of every day. One woman would describe watching fellow inmates hanging from the walls, while guards dragged their lifeless bodies past her cell. And the living conditions? Forget about it. The cells are so dark and filthy that the women couldn't tell if it was day or night. It's infested with lice and insects and all kinds of stuff, and the stench of blood and decay filling up the air. In their desperation, women would scratch at their own skin until it bled, trying to escape the constant itching from insect bites. And to top it off, sexual violence was also a constant from the moment they stepped into this prison. The women were even told that their bodies no longer belonged to them, and every day would become a struggle for survival, while their dignity would be stripped away at every turn.
عم تتعذبي بالنهار وبالليل اغتصاب وأبشع وأقذر الحقارة الموجودة فيهم.
These women's stories offer a glimpse into the unrelenting horror of Syrian prisons. By speaking out, they hope to seek justice, not just for themselves, but for the tens of thousands of Syrians still trapped in such detention centers, enduring the same unspeakable cruelty.
إلى الآن إلى هذه اللحظة الآلاف من النساء في المعتقل.
In Uzbekistan, hidden away next to a chemical plant, there's a woman's prison that few people outside the country have ever heard of. Yet inside this place, women and girls go through some of the harshest treatment imaginable. Here, inmates are subjected to 16-hour workdays, abuse, and also complete denial of their basic human rights. Pretty much they're treated as anything but human. Elderly women, even pregnant women, aren't spared from this relentless cycle. They're forced to work right up until they go into labor, just to afford essentials like food and hygiene products. When the time comes to give birth, instead of receiving proper care, they're taken 10 kilometers away to a district hospital. And the conditions there are far from safe. We have unsanitary rooms, no proper medical supply, and everything from soap to basic hygiene products must be paid for out of their own pockets. You have a lot of pregnant women living in fear here. Prison staff often pressure them to terminate their pregnancies in the first trimester so they can keep working. As a result, many women hide their pregnancies, which does increase the risk of complications and miscarriages. When these tragedies happen, they're often covered up with no medical help provided. Now, for mothers who do give birth, control over their children's life is taken away. Prison staff decide everything: what the children will eat, what kind of health care they'll receive, and how often they can see their mothers, which is barely an hour a day, even if the child is sick. Mothers even reported seeing bruises on their children caused by prison staff, but they stay silent. They know that speaking up could mean solitary confinement, an extended sentence, or their worst fear of all: being separated from their children forever. Basic supplies like diapers, soap, and clothes for these babies aren't provided by the prison. The mothers really have to work relentlessly to provide even the most basic care for their little ones. And when that child turns 3, if their mothers are still serving time, they're sent away, either to live with distant relatives or placed in orphanages, often far away from the prison. In most cases, this marks the end of all contact between the mother and child. Human rights groups including Open Line and House of Human Rights, and also the Association for Human Rights in Central Asia, have been shining a light on these abuses for years. Through their tireless work, they've raised awareness about the horrific conditions inside Uzbekistan's women's prisons. According to these organizations, the situation is even more harrowing for Muslim women. And despite living in a Muslim-majority country, many Muslim women face extreme discrimination in prison. Some have been placed in special punishment cells, where sewage seeps onto the floor and the air is thick with the stench of rot. They can't practice their faith, and the prison staff often tear off their religious garments, prohibiting them from prayer, and subject them to violent treatment simply just because of their beliefs. 2021, a presidential amnesty was finally issued in Uzbekistan, promising to free many prisoners, especially women. Yet, none of these women have benefited from the order. They remain trapped to this day, and as the world slowly hears the stories, human rights organizations continue to fight for change. But inside Uzbekistan's prisons, the cries of these women remain unanswered.
If you haven't done time in Mordovia, you haven't done time at all.
That's how the women who have endured IK2 Mordovia describe it. In Russia, this prison's infamous, and its reputation is enough to make anyone, even those already familiar with the brutal reality of the Russian prison system, shudder. Located in the isolated region of Mordovia, around 300 miles southeast of Moscow, this prison seems stuck in a different era, one that has barely changed since Soviet times. It's a place of misery, where even the basic routines are grueling. Women are forced to wake up at 6 a.m. to participate in group exercises before heading straight to the sewing machines.
Your morning starts from a scream, "Подъем, бляди," which means "get up, whores."
For the next 10 to 12 hours, they stitch uniforms for the Russian military, often working through unbearable pain and exhaustion. Former inmates, like Nadezhda Tolokonnikova, have recounted their experiences of being forced to work up to 17 hours a day, with only one day off every 8 weeks. The living conditions are equally as harsh. Up to 100 women share large dormitory-style rooms crammed with bunk beds. Privacy doesn't exist here. Supervision's also minimal, especially at night, leaving the women in a constant state of fear of being attacked. But what's more, the prison's infested with rats. So even something as simple as going to the bathroom becomes a ritual of having to knock on the doors before going in to scare the rodents away. So go ahead and throw hygiene and safety out the window, making this place feel medieval. Now, what makes Mordovia particularly notorious is its severe isolation and the lack of outside oversight. Human rights groups have little access here, and complaints about conditions are frequent but often ignored. Former inmates like Olga Shilayeva shared stories of routine beatings by guards, including one senior officer who was eventually promoted instead of facing consequences for his cruelty. Now, for many women, the psychological suffering is even worse than the physical. Galena Alexieva, a former deputy minister, recounted how some prisoners were so desperate to avoid being sent to Mordovia that they would cut their wrists or swallow nails. And once there, the sewing sweatshops were just as deadly. You had women losing their fingers to the machines as they would race to meet impossible quotas. And then there's the horrifying story of the cats. Yeah, these little animals, initially brought in to help control the rat population, end up becoming a tool for collective punishment. When prisoners failed to meet their work goals, kittens were thrown into furnaces. That's a pretty sick way to break someone's spirits. Despite the abuse, some women like Yelena Fedoroya fought back in the only way they could, by speaking out. Yelena witnessed beatings in the prison's medical unit and tried to expose the truth to independent media. A criminal investigation was briefly opened, but it was quickly shut down when no one dared to testify, fearing retaliation from the prison authorities. The shocking accounts from Mordovia highlight not only the harsh physical conditions, but a real systemic disregard for human life within its walls. And for the women who survive, freedom isn't just a release from captivity, but a slow recovery from the psychological scars of a prison system designed to dehumanize and destroy.
너주자가 생겼는데 그 너주자를 청산했어요. 도망치면 이렇게 죽인다고 교화생들을 모여놓고 이렇게 도망을 치지 말라고 이런 내용.
When you think of North Korea, images of this harsh regime come to mind, right? But nothing can really prepare you for what goes down inside Kaechon Internment Camp, also known as Camp 14. Guys, this place ain't just a prison, it's a living nightmare, especially for the women trapped inside. Camp 14 stretches across 150 square kilometers of rough landscape, with its farms, mines, and factories hidden deep within its mountains. Over 15,000 prisoners are held here, isolated from the world, men, women, and even children. Each group separated, but sharing one tragic reality. They're stuck here for life, often for crimes they didn't commit. Now, some are born into this camp, a product of North Korea's twisted 3 generations of punishment rule, which means entire families can be imprisoned, with their only crime being related to someone who dared to oppose the regime. Now, for the women serving life sentences, Camp 14 is beyond brutal. They're forced to work endless shifts in coal mines or factories, producing goods like textiles, wigs, and even false eyelashes for export to places like China. Work begins at 5:30 a.m. and stretches into the night, sometimes as late as midnight, with no relief in sight. You cannot imagine the conditions these women face. Despite suffering from hunger, malnutrition, and even tuberculosis, these women have to keep on working, often without proper medical care or food. Speaking of food, rations mostly consist of little more than salted cabbage and corn, which obviously leads to malnourishment, maybe tooth loss. How about blackened gums? Some women resort to eating whatever they find, frogs, insects, maybe rats, just to stay alive. It ain't just a matter of survival here. If they're caught eating anything other than their official rations, they risk severe punishment, sometimes even death. In the factories, women work under the constant hum of machines, their fingers calloused and cracked, sometimes bleeding from overwork. But no matter how hard they work, there's no escape from the suffocating control of the camp. Even during breaks, they're forced to memorize the accomplishments of North Korean leaders and follow strict rules that feel straight out of this dystopian novel. Here are just a few of them that they must obey at all times. 1. No escape is allowed. 2. 3 or more inmates cannot meet together. 3. Stealing is forbidden. 4. You must obey the orders of the guards at all times. 5. Any sign of outsiders or suspicious people must be reported immediately. 6. Inmates must watch each other and report any unusual behavior. 7. You must overfulfill all tasks assigned to you. 8. No contact allowed between men and women unless it's work-related. 9. You must be truly remorseful for your mistakes. And 10. Violate any of these rules and you'll be shot on the spot. Yeah, breaking any of these rules can lead to beatings, torture, or worse, immediate execution by firing squad. Now, what makes Camp 14 so terrifying is that there's absolutely no hope for those trapped inside. When they die, they're wrapped in simple matting and buried in these unmarked graves. No one will mourn them. No one will ever know they existed. And yet, despite the horror of it all, the products made by these women, those wigs, eyelashes, and textiles, make their way into international markets, passing along the supply chain without anyone questioning their origins. The blood, sweat, and tears of these prisoners are sold for profit, while the women themselves are left to suffer, unseen and unheard.